Welcome, everyone, to American Girls, the podcast. This is the podcast where we're reliving the American Girls series book by book, except here on Patreon, where we're doing kind of whatever we want that we think lives within the world of this show. I'm Mary.
I'm still Allison.
And welcome to our episode where we will be reading through an excellent new book. Don't want to get the title wrong.
The Age of Phillis.
Thank you, yes. Which is just come out. It's a very late 2020 book, right, Allison?
That's correct.
It's by Honorée Fanonne Jeffers. I want to make sure it's pronounced correctly. She's a professor at Oklahoma. And this is a really beautiful book. It's a book-length poem, an exploration of the life of Phillis Wheatley.
This book made the long list for the National Book Award, and we'll give you just a little bit more information on the background. Phillis Wheatley was a fairly well-known poet, known to presidents and others, like very important people in the empire in the late 1700s. But this book does something different and makes her more of a full flesh and blood person for us to understand. So from the publisher, in the shadow of the American Revolution, a young African-American woman named Phillis Wheatley published a book of poetry, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, 1773. When Wheatley's book appeared, it would challenge Western prejudices about African and female intellectual capabilities. Her words would astound many and irritate others, but one thing was clear: this young woman was extraordinary. Based upon 15 years of archival research, The Age of Phillis by award-winning poet and writer Honorée Fanonne Jeffers imagines the life and times of Wheatley.
You know, it's very hard almost to categorize this book or to really, the summary almost doesn't do it justice because it offers so many different paths kind of through this book and the things that it wants to comment on. So as we were saying off mic, one of the most arresting kind of pivots to me in this book is that she starts imagining Phillis's life as a child in West Africa before she's enslaved. And we'll get into that in a second, but there's an immediate pivot to the border camps now. There's an exploration of what children... There's an excerpt from actual reports from folks who toured some of these camps, an exploration or an explanation of how a camp that was struggling to house 100 children by adding a single warehouse was adding 500 children to this one camp, and kind of positioning that in a juxtaposition with the experience of the slave ship. So it's a really powerful analysis of not only the life of this very well-studied person from the 18th century, but also now in very explicit terms.
And something that Jeffers does really well is, I think, there's a mention that this took 15 years because she does a ton of archival genealogical research. She does a lot of close textual readings of what Phillis wrote as a young person. And then something she does that I think is a really important change is she stops referring to her as just Phillis Wheatley and also as her married name. Phillis Wheatley did die at the age of 31, but by that time she had married a man who we think is a Bostonian, a Black man, and they had started a life together. There's a lot of questions about what actually happened during their life. We know that he does go to debtor's prison in Boston and that she likely passes away while that's happening, but they have a life and they have a family together. And in the way that she would have understood her life, at some point, she stopped being Phillis Wheatley because she broke away from the family that gave her that name.
Exactly. And she refers to herself in letters at least one time as Phillis Wheatley Peters, taking on the married name of her husband, John Peters. And the author also proves, through her research, that John Peters, after Phillis passes, some biographers immediately treated him as a very irresponsible husband who allegedly abandoned Phillis Wheatley. And she really suggests and argues that that's not the case, and the archive actually demonstrates that he attempted to have a second volume of her poetry published after her death. And subsequently, that doesn't take place, and he dies at the age of 51. But nonetheless, she kind of draws out the fact it's not only a story of Phillis Wheatley's life, but it's sort of like she points us to how people have told different stories of Phillis's life and sort of the stakes for different storytellers over time for why they would show her story, why they would tell her life story in particular ways, and sort of her radical reimagining or her like thinking with different aspects of storytelling, I think really opens up the story of a life that people, I think, who study American history might think they know quite well to actually think about in totally new ways.
She also does something really brilliant, which is she takes existing sources that claim or actually have the voices of enslaved people embedded. So petitions written on behalf of or by enslaved people for their freedom. There's a few different cases throughout the book, or other kinds of documents. And then in italics or through other kinds of devices, she puts in brackets or in some other form what's not being said. And she does this a lot with Phillis. Like there's a few cases where she's writing to an important person and there's all these lines of deference. And then in between those lines, there's what she might have been thinking, which is how frustrating it is to have to talk and to move through the world this way, or what these people may have actually been thinking or wanting to say in making these petitions to be free. And I really like the way that she changes almost everything you think about this person, starting with the name, right? By only calling her Phillis Wheatley, you're thinking of her as a girl and then a young woman who's owned by the Wheatley family and is kind of picked up at the docks, as opposed to a woman who's married and has a family and is trying to write and is very devout and has a network of friends. And it changes that completely.
Yeah, one of the moments where she does that I really liked is when the folks who enslave her, the wife has passed, and she's the wife who has raised her or referred to her as her own child in some ways. Susanna Wheatley, she has passed, and so Phillis is now kind of starting to worry about her own future, and eventually then the husband also passes, and she has to like really reckon with that. But in the interim, her Susanna Wheatley did not want Phillis Wheatley to get married. We learn that in the book, that she didn't want Phillis to even think about marriage as a possibility for her, that it was for other people. And then suddenly when Susanna dies, Samson Occam and others are writing to her saying, you should marry a good Christian man, like you should go be a missionary back in Africa. And there's this sense that Phillis doesn't want that. And in an imagined italic scene in a letter, I think, to Samson Occam, she says, you know, what's the difference between being enslaved by the Wheatleys and sort of like being bought on the marriage market by one of these two men that he suggests to her that she take as a spouse, two men whom she doesn't know and certainly doesn't love. So it sort of presupposes or offers the possibility that Phillis wanted for herself a love match at a time when marriage for women, white or black, would not have been necessarily just about romance, would have definitely been an economic relationship. But she sort of allows an imagination for Phillis to want that for herself and to really put in parallel being enslaved and also like being entrapped into a marriage to someone that she doesn't know.
Yeah, and let's talk a bit, because the book opens with it doesn't open in Boston, or it doesn't open in what becomes the United States. It opens with her life, as you say, in Western Africa, and with her actual parents, right? Not the Wheatleys, but with these people who birthed her and cared for her. And what did you think of the way that the Wheatleys are introduced? Like, I didn't know a lot of the story behind how she kind of came to be in that household, but can you talk a bit kind of how that unfolds? Because that was really surprising to me.
So correct me if I'm wrong here, but they've had children who have passed.
Yes.
So they have children that they've lost. And in some ways, she is like sort of viewed as a weak, like physically weak amongst these other enslaved or potentially to be enslaved folks, from which Susanna selects her to almost be sort of like a proxy child or companion for her actual like natural daughter, who then, you know, grows up in not as siblings, certainly, because Phillis is definitely an enslaved member of their household. But sort of like, it's a weird entry where it's like, okay, this isn't a child who will be a servant in our home. It's introduced in sort of like a very blurred line situation.
If you have heard or listened to the podcast, there's also a BBC companion. It's called I Am Not a Monster. And it's about a woman who claims to have been recruited into a terrorist circle, but she's an American white woman from middle America. And in the course of her time where she claims that she was kind of taken in by this terrorist group, she and her husband go to a market and buy a little boy to be a friend to and companion to their children, but she owns this child. And sort of incredibly, the British reporter finds this kid and actually puts the sister of the woman who owned him on the telephone, and she starts to speak to him, and he is able to speak English because he was part of this household, and he's sort of talking as if he is missing, like, oh, this is like an aunt, right? Like there's a whole discussion of how she's the sister of this woman. And something they do that I think is really brilliant is they let him tell the story. They let him speak for himself and sing songs. And it's really striking to look at the distance between this story, which is set in the 1760s and 70s mostly, and then to look at this story from like 2015, 2016, and the way that this child understood his relationship. And there's a lot of, she was like my mom, she was like my mother. And the reporter kind of struggling to not correct him or not to kind of veer into like what the relationship was, which was ownership. Like that she purchased him to be part of the household the way that she would purchase something else on the market. And it's a very similar story where they kind of like picked him out. And this notion of Phillis kind of being a replacement for dead children. And then as she grows up, she writes epitaphs for grieving women who are part of Susanna's circle. And I think what the author does so well is show that she's kind of pulled into this like terrible storm of trauma and this terrible kind of never ending loop of this family's grief and these other women's grief. And she's supposed to kind of use her skill to like spin it into something.
I think it's interesting too, because in a way it kind of explains or situates her in a situation where Susanna insists on a kind of perpetual adolescence for her. Like she's never allowed, other people in their world are sort of looking at Phillis when she gets to be marriage age saying like, oh, you should make a match for her. And, you know, there's talk in the beginning of this book about sort of the ways that reproduction and relationships are encouraged as an economic incentive for white people who enslave. And yet Susanna, her enslaver, does not want that because she plays this role of like the lost child. She's holding space for that child. And that becomes more meaningful still when her actual daughter gets married and leaves the household. And Phillis writes a letter that's like, I miss you. Like, I wish you were still here. Like, I can't believe you're gone. And Phillis is now like the only proxy sort of child. And so that child, like that, the desire to keep her in prolonged adolescence has very deep roots in how enslaved people and Black people were belittled and thought of as less than and as like adolescent or immature in an almost biological way. If you've read Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, this like burgeoning language of science as a way to explain racial difference, which allows for or makes space for this kind of prolonged adolescence. But as you're saying, that desire also has a real root in the family trauma that happened before Phillis even arrived on the scene.
Yeah, and Thomas Jefferson comes up a few times in this book, and we learn that kind of a kernel that got her going was this idea that George Washington had read Phillis Wheatley's poems, and Jefferson and others were aware or had read some of her work. And Jefferson is cited in here for his comment that, you know, her poetry is really not even worth discussion, right? Like,
yes, he says some comment like it's beneath the dignity of criticism.
Which I think really tells you the extent to which his own mind is so perverted on this subject, and his own mind is so distorted because he sits at a table that was probably made by an enslaved person to eat, and he eats some of the world's best French cuisine by a person that he owns, that he also oversaw the training of in France and on his own estate. And then he has, sex with a woman that he owns, like, and yet to say that this poet is like beneath his commentary.
Right. But I think that allows us to kind of think about, for those who are unfamiliar with Phillis Wheatley, why her publication history matters for more than just the poems themselves. Something that's sort of striking about how we think about her is that Henry Louis Gates Jr. and others have noted, it's not really the substance of her poetry alone that makes her significant. It's the fact that she was published. She's the first Black woman to publish a book in the United States. And she's able to do that in part because Susanna Wheatley and her husband are so ambitious in getting Phillis recognition internationally for her poetry and sort of making her a symbol of not abolition, but what enslaved people are capable of intellectually. So when Phillis Wheatley is writing to a rich British woman whose name escapes me right now, but saying, like, basically, will you be my patron? Will you basically blurb my book to give me the authenticity or the cachet of your reputation? Will you put a quotation, in the frontispiece of my book? There's a lot of different ways that writers, white and Black, would try to get recognition or respect in the publication world in this period. One of the ways to do that, which people still do now, is like send a free copy of your book to someone who's much more famous than you and have them reply to you with some kind of compliment, whether or not they've read it. And then you take that and you add it as a blurb in your book. So when she writes to George Washington she's trying to do that. Like, she literally sends him a letter and is like, what do you think about my poetry? And he's like, hey, I'm fighting the American Revolution, been a little busy, love your poems, writes back to her. So then she takes that cachet and then is writing to folks in England saying, here's my poetry. And Susanna's doing that too. And by the way, she's writing letters for Susanna. Like, she's using her literacy on behalf of even the person to whom she's enslaved. And so she's part of all of these publishing networks. So the fact not only of her poetry is really significant, but the fact that she could gain respect and some sort of traction in this world of publication is really important, as Henry Louis Gates and others point out. So it's even more ridiculous for Thomas Jefferson to say it's beneath the dignity of criticism when so many other people who are at his level socially or higher on both sides of the Atlantic have deemed her work willing of criticism, even if it's just to say, like, yeah, good job. Like, even if they don't have time to read it, they're writing back to her and they're sort of like accepting their role in this like sort of performative networking that's happening. So for him not to do that is even more insane.
Yeah, I think part of what it gets at with him is just kind of the lengths that his mind was able to go to make exceptions for just his own whims, right? Like,
yeah,
he's a person that, when it comes down to it, does a lot of writing on freedom and what we would think of as consent. And yet he consistently for years rapes a young woman he owns.
There's possibly no greater example of magical thinking around racism in our country than the life of Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think he was needed to be only consistent within himself.
I think that's absolutely true. And, like, to be offended when he was running for president and there were political cartoons that actually were explicitly pointing to his relationship with Sally Heming and saying, like, you're a huge hypocrite. So, I mean, like, people weren't just saying this in our lifetime, like, people were saying it in his lifetime as well. And he was hysterical with rage when people did this because he's like, I can't believe somebody would say this about me.
Yeah.
There's no possible way that you can be that angry when someone is saying something that's true unless you're lying to yourself. And the lie is so deep and so delusional that you believe it on a level that it appears to be fact.
Now, like, speaking of, like, lies that are enduring, something this book does that I think is really interesting is it pokes holes at sources that claim to be first or second hand tied to Phillis Wheatley Peters and kind of questions how these people actually knew her or if they actually knew her. And I think something that's so important about this book is it's written by someone who is outside of the historical profession, but, does all the same work. And I think sometimes it takes someone coming in and looking differently at literary sources and saying, well, wait a second, like we're all trusting this narrative. But first of all, how do we know that it is true to the reality of Phillis? And what do we actually know about these people who are saying that they're connected to her? She has these amazing footnotes and this kind of author's note afterward where she says, like, the source for this being true is the source itself. And when you read enough stuff, at least in our area, about 18th century history, there are so many passing references within historical societies about people who were not allowed to be in historical societies, and they're not based on anything.
Absolutely not.
It's a bold statement, but like they're not actually based on a real understanding.
Well, exactly. And you know, it sort of keeps coming up for me in sort of studies of the American Revolution or the early American period, because as I've said, like one of our mentors once commented on a historian of the American Revolution and said he could be so prolific in his publishing because he wrote without fear of research. And basically that's what this author is saying in her excellent piece that she calls Looking for Miss Phillis. And it's this really amazing account if you are curious about how historical work happens on the ground, the kind of thing you would do if you, say, wanted to write a biography or you wanted to write a history of anything, even of your own family history. Here's what you do. And so she takes you through this path of going to the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts as a fellow and sort of revisiting a lot of the archival sources that people have taken as a given when they write about Phillis Wheatley. So everyone says if you write a biography, you're standing on the shoulder of giants. If you're writing about someone about whom other people have already published biographies or histories. And what she basically lays out is that there are a couple key biographies that some are from the early American period, so some are from the early 19th century by people who claim to be descendant from Phillis Wheatley or to have known her or the Wheatleys in life. And basically, when people have written biographies in the 20th century, they take as a given or fact everything that the people who wrote those first biographies said is true. And so part of her work was every time she read something that didn't feel right, she would go try to look at the footnote in the 20th century biography, then go to the 19th century biography from which it came, and try to go to the archival sources that those people used to make that claim. And a lot of times it was just sort of like there were no sources. Or she makes a really interesting argument about John Peters. So this is a person about whom she cares deeply. He's really important to her in sort of doing this revisionist work. So he's Phillis's husband. And in the early 19th century, there's a biography that makes it seem like he's a deadbeat and he abandoned Phillis. And this becomes a trope that is taken up in other Phillis Wheatley biographies. And as she makes plain, this is a really problematic assumption to make because it's a really loaded assumption or narrative to push out into the world, particularly when talking about a Black man and his role in the family and the history of the family. So she reinvestigates a lot of this stuff, and she's the person who sort of calls out modern day biographers and is like, hey, he didn't abandon her. I found him in the census. I found this letter at American Antiquarian Society where he's trying to have a second volume of her works published after her death. And then she can pivot and she can do this because she's not a historian. So if you're a historian, you could only write so far as your archive allows you to write. So if you're writing about Black folks in the past or people about whom there aren't maybe as voluminous of sources as we might have for, say, George Washington, sometimes you don't know. There's huge holes and there's not much you can say about that. If you're a poet, you can imagine yourself into those silences using fiction, using poetry. And she does that in this book in really beautiful ways. And the way that she resolves this or speaks on it is that she imagines this beautiful love story between John Peters and Phillis Wheatley to kind of counter what she views as a really toxic narrative that biographers have put out for 200 years.
Yeah, and she does that in a way that's consistent throughout the book, not just with Phillis's husband, but with other people. I mentioned that she kind of fills in what might have been the story around other documents. A short one that I really recommend, particularly if you're a teacher or you talk to people about this story. I think it's pretty well known in some Revolutionary history. The woman who's often called Mum Bet, but is Elizabeth Freeman. it's sort of writing around a document that she makes in 1781, which is a petition for her freedom. And there's a whole, I mean, a lot of this book is about like, well, how do you know what's true? Right? Like if the whole record has been written by colonizers or written by people who don't think the subjects of this story are people, what do you trust? And I think she does this so well in just a few lines. I was hit by my mistress, or I was not. I stood between her and my black child, or I did not. And who must speak for me in order for you to believe? If a white man says a word, that word is true, can squat upon a mountain, and behold, it will spread as gospel. And there was a part that really kind of stopped me in my tracks, where she talks about how actually making this case for Elizabeth Freeman required a white person to make the case in court. And it goes on to say, a white man had to plead my case in order for me to be free. And so at the end of my life, what I shall hold on to is a gold necklace and a gravestone inscribed with the title of Efficient Helper. Perhaps some kindness because I tended to white children seeking mouths before my own child could eat. And just to like pick, portions of this apart for a second, you would find a lot of this same kind of information about another enslaved person of the 18th century on a website like Find a Grave. You would find what was written on their stone. You could find a link to court proceedings. You could find, the basic documents, and a lot of museums in Massachusetts have them. Like, what is the case that this woman made? But it's not going to convey the emotion of what that might have meant for a real person. Like, that's why poets and historians need each other. Like, this is a beautiful interplay. Yeah. Like, it required archivists and historians to maintain documents to make at least that trace of it possible. But it required a totally different approach to the past to say, well, what's the emotion around this, or what's the resonance and what's the feeling? And I'm not making a binary of like historians use facts and poets use feelings. That's not what I'm saying. I think it takes a different kind of approach to say, well, let me add a texture to this that goes beyond presentation of information. It's not a strict narrative. It's not strict exposition. It's what would it have felt like to know that your truth was not true unless a white person said it?
Right. And according to this disciplinary standards of history, so to speak, when you bump up against these silences, as you know, oftentimes it suggests that as a historian, you can't fill those silences. You just have to acknowledge them. And as you're saying, we're not suggesting that poets like trade in feelings and historians trade in facts, but actually both trade in stories. And what a poet can do is imagine a language for that silence and situate it within the larger story, and also in the way that historians do as well. So as you're saying, they're sort of have a symbiotic relationship. They're both doing the same thing, which is that they're trying to understand what it means to be human, how people order their world, and explain kind of power dynamics shaping their actions and their lives to themselves. What stories do people tell themselves to make sense of what's happening to them? And when the archive doesn't give that to you, poets can kind of step in and imagine themselves in that space. And even if it's not, like, we'll never know the truth of what Phillis Wheatley made of her own life and experiences. But I think, if anything, like reading her words, her poetry, it's so beautiful, the moments when she imagines kind of the terror that Phillis felt, or the love that she felt for her husband. And it also reminds me of the poverty of that silence in the archive. Like, we'll never know what Phillis felt, and I can still appreciate this one imagination of maybe what Phillis's experiences were like.
Well, and I think sometimes too, there's a historian that she quotes specifically as a kind of preface to one of the sections, and it's Marcus Rediker, who wrote The Slave Ship, which is generally regarded, I think, as one of the strongest research books, because he comes from it as a maritime historian, kind of talking about what is the maritime experience of being and working on one of these ships. And to kind of put that up against like other documents that she reimagines as poetry, there are selections in here from the incidents that led to the creation of the insurance industry, and this idea that people were going to die in these passages, and at some point business people involved in the Atlantic slave trade made the decision to find a way to always make money, regardless of the health or of what happened to the people they held as cargo. And I think one of the most affecting points of this is a story of people being thrown overboard alive. And based on the real testimony of a man from Newport, Rhode Island, his outrage that one of his, quote, good chairs was used to actually put someone overboard. And I think what she does is, whether she's talking about a slave ship, whether she's talking about detention on the border, other periods that she's talking about, she doesn't need to write in an expository way, these people are cruel. She lets them show it to you instead. There's also a place where there are imagined documents from people who are like writing definitions about words, like how to define people of different races, or this kind of stunning moment where a person is examining the body of a Black man and he's trying to understand how it relates to the human species. And he has this kind of jolt that goes through him that this person is human. And it's like, she doesn't have to say like Thomas Jefferson was cruel or demented. Right. She lets it come out through the poetry. Like, I think sometimes it's like some historians show you a French garden. This is kind of like a field where things are popping up.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, this is definitely more of a show, not tell approach. Like, I think something that's really beautiful about this, that is sort of like the work of Maggie Nelson in a way, which is a different genre of like memoir, but integrating, in her case, theoretical works and then using that as a language for her own experience. This is having archival work right in the midst of her poetic work, and they're really clearly in conversation, and she doesn't have to be heavy-handed in making an argument. As you're saying, it's just there, and it's impossible to miss. And I think that that's really kind of where you see such high level or such amazing creativity and thinking of the people who think with the life of Phillis Wheatley to all these different ends. And something I would just point out, if people read this book and are really interested in Phillis Wheatley, is that there's a scholar named Tara Bynum who has done a lot of great work on Phillis Wheatley, and from a kind of a different perspective of she's exploring pleasure in the 18th century in Black culture, in enslaved and free people's daily lives. And so she kind of does similar work in the sense of, I'm actually working with her on a different project where I got to interview her for this project called Hidden Literacies that'll come out in a couple months. But she took a receipt of an enslaved accountant in Newport he had a pig roast with friends, other enslaved friends. And so she actually does this really beautiful reading of just a receipt of the food that they bought for this pig roast. And it allows her to actually tell a story about the fact that, like, what pleasure looked like in their lives. Like, they made rum punch and, they had this great day out together. So it's sort of speaking back against like the meta narrative of trauma of slavery, that there is moments of joy, which you also see in the writings of someone like Toni Morrison. But also that here's an enslaved man who's actually participating in the slave economy. Like, he's getting the rum from somewhere, right? That's so it's like, it's a different way of like kind of complicating a lot of these histories. So yeah, a lot of great stuff out there that people can check out.
I think what she also makes very accessible is the religious world of Phillis Wheatley is very different from the intellectual world that I live in. And I have read her poems as a way to try to understand, something about her experience. And I struggled. And it probably seems counterintuitive to say, I read this person's writing and I didn't really get a lot about them. And then I read someone else writing about them and I felt like I understood them better. But I think that happens even with much better known or arguably more accessible poets. Like, you can read a lot of Emily Dickinson in 10 minutes because it's quick.
You
right?
can,
like,
but, and it's like, but would you walk away after those 10 minutes with any greater sense of what the poems are about?
No, because if you look at her devoid of context, I don't think it means a lot. But I think, for me, it took going to her house and having someone say, this is the way that people thought about form in Emily Dickinson's time. And then moving tiles around and saying, this is the way that she thought about form. And this is why this is path breaking.
Yeah, and that's why I'm interested to check out that Dickinson show on Apple TV, which, full disclosure, I've not seen, but many people have recommended to us. That I think you can take other genres, like a TV show that's comedic and makes modern day references, like, you know, a biography, a novelization of her life, not unlike the Phillis Wheatley poetry narrative, and you can walk away with some kind of truth of their experience, or like some real genuine exploration of who they are and what they were trying to do in their work. I'm not really here for a lot of the criticism of these kind of attempts to study someone's life in biography that's not purely just the facts, ma'am, because if you only have a just the facts, ma'am approach, or in other words, you only comment on what you have actual archival proof to document, there are so many people's histories who would never make it past that test of, you know, authentication. If you think about something like Wikipedia, they have a notability requirement. And an issue with that, if you're familiar with Wikipedia, is that to be notable, you have to be written up in authoritative sources. So, for example, let's say that you're a female artist in the early 20th century. You're not getting written up in the New York Times. Does that mean that you weren't notable, that your work wasn't important, that we shouldn't have your own Wikipedia page? That's what this great project, Art Plus Feminism, is about, which you can definitely check out. But I mean, there's different standards of authentication. And I think something like this, you know, a novel-long poetry exploration of Phillis Wheatley's life opens up a space for the kinds of explorations we might do about a lot of these histories for whom a traditional archive doesn't exist.
This author also went to great pains, you know, to that point, to see as many places as she could, because she's based in Oklahoma primarily. So traveling to all of these places that were part of Peter's life was a trip for her. Literally, she went to different parts of the world. She went all over New England. And I loved her kind of passing reference to the fact that while she was in Worcester at the American Antiquarian Society, she made connections and ended up going to Waltham, to the state archives. And it was like, well, one thing leads to another. And I think that's just very true of how this work evolves, that you have to actually go out and see things. And she does something that I think not enough people do, which is she points out what she couldn't find. So she points out the fact that she doesn't know where she is buried. If she did have children, it's not in the records, and here's why. And you know, like, we both do different things for our day job, but, you know, part of why museums and cemeteries and other places are preserved, in part because you get something out of the experience of actually going there.
Absolutely. And also the the kismet of running into a person who knows a place that might have the answer to the question that you're trying to answer. Like, there's so much to, you know, doing research that is so sort of like situational, and the kismet of it all. And, you know, I know someone who was at the American Antiquarian Society doing research. She studies Indigenous history in early America. And there happened to be someone else there who knew that that's what she did. And he randomly was like, hey, didn't you say that you do Indigenous stuff? I'm reading this diary that has an in-depth description of a Mohegan house. And it wasn't in the catalog, because when this diary was cataloged, it was in the 19th century, when frankly Indigenous culture was not at the forefront of the minds of catalogers about what mattered in a text. And so it wasn't in the catalog record, and there are no like very detailed descriptions of Mohegan homes from that period. So she went over and it was like, whoa, there's this amazing thing that's been here this whole time. And only that this guy knew that I was there and interested in that did he tell me. If not, he would have just like flipped the page and kept going, because it wasn't on his topic or whatever. So I like too that her research essay kind of preserves those moments of kismet, of like coming back and huddling with someone at AAS who then helps her get to the next step in her research, like points her in a different direction.
Yeah, I know that. I think too, like, part of what this points to is you always connect to something in your subject or you wouldn't be doing it. I mean, this shows the obvious value of a poet studying a poet, because there's so much that I think captures the essence of the experience of this historical person versus a strict truth of it. much in the same way as like Mariah Carey working with someone to tell her own story, or, a person who journals and writes lyrics working to tell their own story. I think she's able to discern something about what a person puts into a poem and what that says about them. And I really liked the way that she took seriously this change that Phillis undergoes, where she becomes a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And that part of that also means a loss of the person who she was when she was born, and what that might have meant for her. But also, as you mentioned off mic, that devout faith and that Christianity takes up a lot of her time, but it also forms the basis of her language with one of her very good friends, this woman who is enslaved, with whom she corresponds over and over in Rhode Island. So it's this huge part of her life and a huge part of her poetry. And I think with this book, I will be able to go back to her poetry and understand it better, because I'll have this as a kind of guide of where that transformation came from.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. And I think there is an article by Tara Bynum that is on Phillis Wheatley and friendship, and specifically examines that relationship with that enslaved friend. And really just saying that the erotics of their friendship in those letters is about the depth of feeling they share over their Christian faith and how that is a refuge for them. And also she makes a really important point that it's important to think about Black people's lives in the 18th century as something other than something like time that they spent talking about the situation of being enslaved. Like, in other words, her point in this article, one of them is that, Phillis Wheatley doesn't talk to this friend and say, like, isn't it terrible that we're enslaved or that we're Black in the 18th century? In fact, they spend most of their correspondence talking about their religious experience and their devotion that they share with one another, these common deep feelings that form the depth of their friendship. And, that's really important to recover too, in addition to all of this very real trauma that, the author captures in depth as well. Something I think that's really inspirational about this too is that, if you read about a historical subject, I think as trained historians, our response would be to come up with an article to explore, or a book to explore some facet of their lives that another writer has not covered. I think it's so beautiful that as a poet, her response to a creative person's life, in some ways the highest tribute, is to be creative about their lives, to respond to a poet's life with poetry. And I wonder, if there can be other spaces of that in the study of Phillis Wheatley and others. Not going to bring Hamilton into this, but you can see that too, that, that's another way of responding to history.
I am working with people right now who wrote a series of songs, and they wrote a musical about the stuff that I talk about. It's so cool. The stuff that I talk about every day at work. And I was sitting on a Zoom call with them and another historian, and we both just were so floored because we were listening to these songs, and we've had the privilege of watching a full dress rehearsal over Zoom. They're based in the Midwest and we are not. And they wrote these songs about what it meant to be a factory worker in the 1840s and what it meant to resist and to form a community. And we both were just sitting there eyes wide open, and we're listening along. And I can see the woman who wrote the music. She's taking notes, and she's her brain is in one place. And the woman who is running the show, it's her brain is in another place. And then he and I are picking apart the lyrics. And what they wanted from us was where people should listen to these songs, spatially, to connect with the meanings. And we were so not helpful, because we were like, well, you could listen to this song in 18 places. And they were like, okay, but where? But it was so awesome. These things that I have thought about, these people were able to capture some essence of it. And I've read at this point, everything I can get my hands on these factory workers. I've read the books, I've read the articles, I've read the primary sources, I've read their diaries, I've read, the city directories. And then I was like, in 3 minutes, they nailed it. It's so and I understand that it's a symbiotic relationship, but I would say genuinely a highlight of my career was talking with them. And they said, after we talked with you, we reworked the lyrics of this one song so that it would better reflect like how these conversations led to this movement. And I was like, what? How?
So cool. Oh my God.
I was like, how do people, it's like me with the Bee Gees again. It's like, how? No, like, I don't understand. I am because I think, you know, different jobs train you to do different things. It's like, I'm pretty good at writing an email or writing a post or telling a story or leading a walk. And then I look at what, you know, this author does in 50 words and it's like, oh, okay. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Like the less is more times a million, like what she accomplishes on one page. I mean, honestly, that poem about the man saying that he's upset that he can't recoup his chair, that an enslaved person was pushed into the ocean to drown in, like his chair, like that bothers him. That says more than any 30-page article could about the emotion or the lack of emotion that people could feel about this as humans.
Yeah, 100%. And that's why I think anyone teaching history in a classroom or outside of it, or just wanting to teach it to yourself, you know, I think the poverty of your experience will be huge if you're not including in your experience not only reading historical books or archival documents or whatever, or going to history sites, but also taking in some of these, you know, artistic approaches, whether it's reading a novel, listening to a musical, looking at artwork, all of these different things, because they're all just different ways of accessing, you know, the similar threads of what it meant to be human in particular situations in the past.
Yeah, I think that's why we've talked about things like quilts, like dresses, like, you know, all these various objects of history and how people connect to them. I did also find that, you know, again, she cites Marcus Rediker and his notion that his book was hard to write and it should be hard to read. Because if you've written a book on a slave ship and it's not hard to read, you probably didn't accomplish very much because you didn't really capture, you know, anything about what that experience meant to real living people and people who didn't make it. And I found myself like touching the pages of this book a lot, which is something I also do on gravestones, because I find like the sparseness of the words actually helps me focus. Like I was doing a project this week, and because I'm like this person, I learned about a guy who died, and I was like, well, I have to go drive to his gravestone.
Sure.
So it took me like 2 hours to find it. Because I couldn't find it in the cemetery. But once I've committed, I just keep looking.
Sure.
And I find that I do that where I'm like, I have to touch the name. Like I have to physically, you know, I also have to be stopped in museums because I will touch.
Have had to pull you back. Like it's actually a relief that Emily D's white dress is no longer in that house museum, because
I know
every time I've been there with you, I'm like, we're leaving there with this dress, and like I don't want that. Like I don't want to go to jail yet or ever, because I've not been to Dollywood. I've not done certain things in my life I want to do. I'm not willing to throw it away so you can wear the white dress.
For the sake of this show, I'll say what I'm about to disclose for legal reasons is a joke, and you can decide if it is.
Wow.
Like I touch things everywhere if I think no one is looking.
Yes, you do. Yep.
So because I find like sometimes I want that connection to, like, I want to imprint it. I want to remember it. I want to, yeah. And it's the sparseness of the words on the stone. Like I'd done all this research on this person, and then it just had his name and his dates. And I was like, well, I want to imprint this. I want to remember. So I want to touch it, and I want to kind of like take this in. And I found with this book, I was able to process the information differently because I wasn't trying to plow through a 200-page narrative history about her life. I was thinking about her life. And then every time you flip the page, you're confronted with these very different kinds of documents. And when she takes you to the border camp, it's a shock because you don't see it coming. And it made me think harder and better and interpret this on a deeper level.
I think something that was really powerful about that juxtaposition for me is that it actually invites you to think about history in a really important way, which is that on the one hand, we say history is a foreign country, like, you know, none of us will ever know what that's like. But on the other hand, people like to say history repeats itself, which is, of course, not true. But I think something that she gets at in juxtaposing something that's very modern with this past is to say, we will never know what it feels like to be Phillis Wheatley. Like, sometimes I try to imagine a grounding exercise, actually, that I've gotten from Linda Berry, who's a really great graphic comic artist and memoirist, where she imagines moments in her life where she says, okay, I'm sitting in this moment in a grocery store, like whatever it is, what's immediately in front of me? What can I recall that was to my left, to my right, behind me? What did it sound like? What were the smells associated with it? Like, she does all these sensory grounding exercises to help ground her in a moment in her life. And you can imagine that for Phillis Wheatley, but you'll never know really the truth of that. So that's sort of what I mean by, like, it's a foreign country, but you can also appreciate the ways that it doesn't repeat, but it resonates when she gets to the border camp. And you see that there's a lot of similar themes playing out right now about, forced detention, cruel treatment, awful environmental conditions, suffering of children, all of these things. It's not playing out what happened with Phillis Wheatley in real time or a one-for-one comparison, but it resonates because the themes feel familiar.
Well, and she's not telling you they're familiar. She's letting you think it. And I think that's what we've been kind of getting at with the beauty of her writing.
Right. Yeah.
She doesn't need to tell you.
Yeah. I mean, the best writers, I think, show and not tell. If you have to do a lot of exposition, that's probably like a 911 that you need to like do a rewrite, right? So, and the strongest stories, I think, can speak for themselves. And I think she lets that happen in her book. And I think it's really powerful.
So you were talking about history, and I know that that's something that actually came up today in the inauguration with the woman who I believe is the nation's youngest poet laureate. Is that true?
That's correct. I believe she's only 23 years old. Her name is Amanda Gorman. We're recording the day of the inauguration. I should just say it was really beautiful to watch something where people wanted to celebrate what the most idyllic form of our democracy should be about, even as we sit with all of its contradictions and hypocrisies and the very real traumas and tragedies of our world right now. First of all, Michelle Obama showed up looking like she was doing Prince cosplay, and it was like too much for me. It almost took me out. It was so beautiful. Lady Gaga was there. I mean, I don't have to talk about how much I love Lady Gaga. It's like too much. I repeatedly am trying to figure out how to rip an MP3 of her jazz version of Bad Romance that she sang to Tony Bennett on his birthday in her documentary. It's like, that's how deep I am, okay? So she did the national anthem. That was beautiful. J-Lo sang This Land Is Your Land, which has a long, I guess, colonial or imperial kind of significance, but also it's a deep protest song. Bruce Springsteen, of all people, did a keynote about this at South by Southwest a few years ago, if you're interested. Just putting that out there. But literally in the middle of This Land Is Your Land, if you've not seen it, she just starts singing. She just says, "Let's get loud." She sings it in the middle. You're like, wait a second. I literally was like, am I having a stroke? Like, when that happened, I was like, am I having a stroke? Did she just say, "Let's get loud"? And I had to explain to Anna, because I was watching it with her, and Anna like doesn't really know J-Lo's catalog. And I was like, that's a J-Lo classic. Like, she just wrote one of her songs into This Land Is Your Land. Like, I'm not sure Pete Seeger wrote sign off on that, but here we are. Okay. Then Joe Biden is sworn in. He gives a talk. Then we get Amanda Gorman, who's 23 years old. She's the youngest poet laureate in the nation's history. She's from California, like our new vice president. She went to Harvard. She was wearing a ring and other jewelry gifted to her by Oprah. We would all love a gift from Oprah. I would love some of her shaker furniture. I'm not going to go there right now, but Oprah, if you're listening, I'm here.
She's not.
Damn it, Allison. Why can't you just
She's not
let
on
me
our
live with
Patreon
that?
list. I know. I'm sorry. She's not on our Patreon list.
Okay, fine. Someday. Not yet. Oprah, if you're listening and you've since logged on, I just want to apologize on behalf of Allison. And, I'm still here wanting to be your friend. So she reads this really beautiful poem. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because you should just go listen to her read it herself. But I just want to read an excerpt of it to just kind of speak to how beautiful it was and how she really acknowledges kind of the challenge of the moment in our nation's history. She finished the poem after the insurrection at the Capitol, and she acknowledges that in this poem. But also it's sort of like a very hopeful message. So here's just an excerpt. Quote, "Victory will not lie in the blaze, but in all of the bridges we have made. That is the promise made, the hill we climb if only we dare it. Being America is more than a prize we inherit. It is the past we step into and how we are apparent. We have seen the force that would shatter our nation rather than share it. It would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. This effort very nearly succeeded. While democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith, we trust. While we have our eyes on the future, history has our eyes on us. So it goes on. It's really beautiful. I'm not doing it justice. Please go check it out in its entirety. But there was just something about it where she really acknowledges the weight of our history with all of its complications, but still points us to somewhat of a hopeful place, you know. And at one point she says, "There is always light if only we are brave enough to see it, if only we are brave enough to be it, if only we are if only to be at, if only we are brave enough to be it." So that's her ending of the poem, is kind of like pointing to, you know, we can move towards the light if we move there together. And I don't want to say that she was sort of enforcing or suggesting kind of like these false calls for unity that have happened after the insurrection. I think she's acknowledging there are very real differences in our country, but she is also saying, you know, that we survived this real attempt to dismantle democracy 2 weeks ago, and that, you know, it is with hope that we move to this new future. But I think in her poem, and a lot of people said this after the inauguration, in the few moments that she spoke with her poetry, she distilled so much of the complicated feelings people had going into today. And I think that is the power of poetry, is sort of giving voice or words to, you know, really complicated feelings or emotions and ideas, and bringing them all together and articulating it in a way that a lot of people can't. So, you know, it was, to me, like the most impressive part of the inauguration, for sure.
You know, I wouldn't say like that we want modern recording artists kind of getting up there and like going off, but I do think it's always interesting on occasions like this that like so many people have to stick to scripts of things like this land is our land, versus like if we gave other kinds of artists that same latitude to say something, right? Like, and I know that J-Lo is saying something by singing that song. I know that Lady Gaga is saying something by singing the national anthem, but I think part of the power of the poetry is it's a pause to just let an American speak.
100%. Yeah.
You know, like no one was passing around the mic to any other Americans to just give them a moment. I honestly feel like we would be better off as a country if literally any author we've covered thus far on this show got 5 minutes to speak.
Jessica Simpson, 5 minutes at the inauguration.
Yeah, I think she'd have something valuable. Like, she's not the top of the list, but I think she'd have something valuable to say. I do. Wow. I think she'd pull it out.
I think she would pull it out. Mariah Carey.
Heck, I'd give Tiger Woods 5 minutes.
Allison, absolutely not. Tiger Woods, are you kidding? No, absolutely, Allison, no. No.
I'm not going to tell you if I'm kidding.
You're not kidding. This is why I'm yelling. It's like, you're not kidding. Oh my God. All I want to say, let me move to a celebrity who actually deserves to get airtime on this show. Yesterday was Dolly Parton's birthday. If she doesn't get a Presidential Medal of Freedom tomorrow, I am going to officially protest.
No, I know.
I'm sorry. What's Tiger Woods done for COVID, Allison? Did he fund a vaccine?
We don't know. So
yeah, we would know, because his Instagram is entirely spawn. He'd be like telling the world. Instead, he's like, "Hey guys, I'm repping these golf balls. Thanks."
I mean, his story is complex, and I think, you know, like in the way that we enjoyed that documentary, we learned something about his time. No, I'm serious. Like, it is not unlike this book where it's other people interpreting what his life means.
That's true.
Like, I think Tiger Woods is genuinely as inaccessible a human as Phillis Wheatley Peters. Genuinely.
I think that's actually really true. And I think the difference is that obviously there's the distance of time and the erasure of key archives that keep us from accessing Phillis Wheatley, whereas with Tiger Woods, I think there's also an erasure of archive, but there's also a shocking lack of self-awareness that I actually don't think, even if he was willing, that he could narrate the truth of any of his motivations at any time. That's what's so shocking about the excerpted interviews in that documentary, is that there's such a shocking lack of self-awareness to any of the conversations he has about himself or his greater meaning in the culture, to the point, like, not to bring my friend Oprah up again, but here we go, when he's on Oprah in the 90s and she's like, what does it mean for you to be the first Black, like, man to win the Masters? He's like, well, I actually call myself like he comes up with some like
Conjunction.
Yeah. And like brought me right back to Raven-Symoné also saying to Oprah, don't call me African American because I'm not. And she was like, people are going to have a problem with you saying that. And she's like, who, me? I understand there's a lot of complicating things going on, but I think his lack of self-awareness, even in that moment, to understand that that would be a controversial thing for him to say, or to not have a clear explanation of why not, would make it difficult, I think, for him to be the subject of a memoir.
I also think, because we learned something from this book, I think part of what that documentary showed us was this whole notion that, like, as soon as he made a mistake, it became very public, right? And he immediately was put into this category with all of these tropes that he was a bad husband, a bad father, that he was a Black man who was acting out and having relationships with white women. And honestly, like, I'm not trying to draw a line between Phyllis's husband and Tiger Woods, but I just did.
Here we are. Yeah.
Here we are. I'm just saying.
No, but actually that's a really good point, because that's exactly the point she makes in that afterword, is like, these tropes about Black men are so strong, and one way to redress them is to revisit historical narratives of Black men and investigate whether the archive actually supports these narratives that we've accepted as fact, or if in this case it's a 19th century white man who writes this book. He has no knowledge of Phillis personally, from a very like shady, non-existent archive. He just projects all of these tropes onto her husband, which then are accepted as fact through the ages. So if that is true of Phyllis's husband, like, for how many other Black men in history have been the victims of this cruel stereotyping? I don't want to say Tiger Woods is a victim. I don't believe that's the case. I think he is a victim of his parents' ambition. Like, truly, when you watch the documentary, I don't want to pity him, because he's an incredibly rich person who has hurt a lot of people. His wife is the victim. His wife and children are the victims of that documentary. But at the same time, I think culturally, a lot of stuff has been mapped on him that is indicative of our larger racial problems.
Well, in the early introductory essay on sources written by Jeffers, she talks about the fact that growing up, Phillis Wheatley, as she knew her then, had this special place in her life because she was one of the silhouettes that got put up on the board for Black History Month in her segregated school, that she was this kind of exemplary person who was pulled out. And I think what she and others, including Ta-Nehisi Coates, have written about in a really important way is to say, if you only pull out these people once a year, or, just in 1 month of the year, and put silhouettes or put pictures on the board, you haven't taught a truth about Black history. And I think Tiger Woods probably was raised on that exact kind of history also, where it was like, there is greatness, but there was no nuance to teach him what that would mean if he actually reached it. Like, how to actually handle that mantle of responsibility. And there's no like, Phillis Wheatley didn't write a pamphlet afterwards like, hey, everyone, like, this is how I'm dealing with my networking with George Washington, unkind words from Thomas Jefferson, here's how I'm managing it. Like, she didn't write that. And she wasn't able to write her own story to say, hey, everyone, I'd really prefer if you just call me Phillis Peters. Thank you so much.
Well, and I think that's why, like, not to bring a different pop culture thing into this, but I think that's why Hillary Baldwin is actually showing her whiteness, when she's someone who has obviously like spun this whole narrative that she's from Spain and Spanish, and like come to find out she's from Massachusetts and white, and her parents are white, and now they've retired to Spain, and she used to go to Spain periodically in the summer as a child, but not like, she is not Spanish. And it's complicated because being Spanish is read as non-white in other parts of the world, but not in the United States. Like, we read people from Spain as white for the most part. But she has been able to trade on this, like, both whiteness and kind of non-whiteness to benefit economically as an influencer and so on. But when she was called out, she kind of jumped on Instagram immediately, was like, hey guys, yeah, so people have called me out. People are like confused about my story, I guess. So I'll clarify some things, and then proceeds to clarify absolutely nothing.
Yep.
And she can do that because she's white. Like, people are willing to move on from this and be less, and, you know, not punish her for the rest of her life, most likely, because she can enjoy truly the privilege of whiteness, which is that you can fail and it won't define you forever. Whereas, you know, if you are a person in the public eye who is not white, often you are held to a standard that's impossible to maintain. And then that people are either rooting for you to fail, as with Tiger, or when you do make a mistake or have some kind of like personal issue, you're held on a much higher platform. It's a different measuring stick. And Hillary Baldwin is not subjected to that, or has not been, to my knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Like, do we end by keeping Hillary/Hilaria Baldwin in the same universe as Phillis Wheatley Peters? I don't know.
Absolutely not.
They don't really. Phillis doesn't deserve that. I honestly can't recommend this book highly enough. I think it's important to pace yourself with it, because it's a difficult read in the best way possible. I also think if you like this kind of style, there are historians who have looked at these lines between fact and fiction and use, you know, as you've mentioned before, like use these kind of boundaries in a permeable way. I would say Taya Miles is one of the best examples of that. Her writing is really excellent, and she pulls a lot from Toni Morrison as a way to try to understand truths of an experience outside the conventional record.
That's absolutely true. Great recommendation. And also, we'll just plug this author's future book. I don't know if it's out yet, but she's writing a book on W.B. Du Bois, and I can't wait to read that. I really, really enjoyed this book.
Yes, I did too. He goes on a lot of trips.
I'm into it. I'm excited to check it out.
Me too.
So, Allison, I guess, you know, I don't know what we're doing next time, but we will release that soon. We have some ideas. We have some plans.
We do. I'm as always very grateful to people who take the time to listen to us on Patreon. We get so excited every time we get an email that we have a new person who is listening along. So we really appreciate all of you. And we love when you watch things with us. So stay tuned for those announcements as well.
You know, I don't want to say it on the show in case we don't end up doing it, but I kind of want to speak it into existence. Which
do it.
That, you know, we're in a World War II frame, and, you know, my favorite World War II movie is a little gem called A League of Their Own. So I'm sort of demanding. There's absolutely no crying in baseball, but you may cry, and maybe must cry, in the final scene in which they all sing the theme song of the Rockford Peaches, written by one Betty Spaghetti, who's then widowed during the season. We will be watching A League of Their Own.
That's
We're
heartbreaking.
a member of the All-American League. I can't wait. I'm going to be out of my mind doing this. Cannot wait.
That's what I wanted for Molly, as opposed to a color war that had no purpose. But
I'm so upset. Like, I can't even. Val Tripp, like, sleep with one eye open. That's all I have to say.
Mary, don't.
Okay, allegedly. No, I would never hurt anybody. And maybe she's probably a beautiful person. That's all I know.
She is a beautiful person.
Like, we've only heard really wonderful things about her, which has made us laugh about, like, some of the stuff we've said on the show, because it's, like, so insane based on what we've heard. But, you know, that's where we're at right now. So anyway, please stay with us for watch-alongs, we love the Discord channels that are popping up. Again, if there's a theme or topic that you think warrants a channel, please just message one of us, and we're happy to create it. We have an expat channel, which is poppin'. I'm not an expat, but I pop into that channel all the time. They have great combos about Duncan and stuff. I feel like I can speak to that. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. We so appreciate you. Allison, where can people contact you?
Yeah, find me at Allison Horrocks on Twitter and on Instagram. And I also really love connecting with people on Goodreads. That's really the place where I keep that information. And I like that we actually have a group on there for Patreon folks as well. Mary, if people want to find you.
Thank you to the listener who created the Goodreads group. If anybody finds me on there, I just want to state from the jump, I refuse to rate books on Goodreads. Like, that's personal. That's for me to know. But I use the to read function quite a bit, and I'm happy to be in that group and check out what's going on. Please follow me on Instagram at Mimi Mahoney. Feel free to DM me at any time. Twitter at Mary Mahoney 123. Listen, I love hearing from people. It's great. I get into all these convos. So thank you so much. We genuinely so appreciate all of you. And we're really looking forward to our next episode.
Yay.